The gilded spoon was bathed in the gentle golden light of cascading crystal chandeliers. The light wasn't warm. It simply served to enhance the sparkle of the silver cutlery, the crystal wine glasses, and the expensive jewelry of the ladies in attendance. The gilded spoon wasn't just a restaurant. It was a symbol, a measure of power and wealth in Manhattan. John Caldwell, the CEO of Caldwell Holdings, didn't belong here in the way the others did. He sat alone at his leather-upholstered booth, while a lively buzz of conversation, the clinking of silverware, and the vibrant sound of a live piano filled the room. To John, it was all just noise. He was accustomed to the cold silence of his office, where multi-million-dollar decisions were made with a single nod. Across from him sat Jack, his 10-year-old son. The boy sat stiffly, his legs held fast in the metal braces that had become a part of his life after the accident 2 years prior. Jack had once been a lively boy, but now his smiles were a rare sight. John looked at Jack and felt an invisible ache, a profound sense of helplessness. He could manipulate the stock market and acquire huge corporations, but he couldn't buy his son back the ability to run. This time he had brought Jack out, not because he wanted to, but because of his therapist's advice. Let him socialize, Mr. Caldwell. In another corner of the room, Mina glided between tables. She was the only dark-skinned waitress in the restaurant. To John and the other wealthy patrons, she was just part of the background. They didn't see the intelligent, thoughtful eyes hidden behind her mask or the calloused hands from hard work. They only saw a swift professional and invisible server. But to Mina, this world was far from invisible. She observed everyone listen to fragmented bits of conversation and paid special attention to the boy sitting with the powerful man at the corner table. Mina saw a craving for connection in Jack's eyes, a craving she knew all too well. The piano suddenly shifted to a gentle classical waltz. Jack, who had been struggling to cut his meat with his fork, stopped. His gaze was fixed on the couple slowly gliding across the floor. A feeling surged within the boy, an irresistible impulse. Jack slowly put down his fork, his hands trembling as he reached out to Mina, who was passing their table. "Miss, could you dance with me?" Jack's invitation, soft as a whisper, had the power to plunge the entire restaurant into silence. The piano music seemed to pause in that moment. John felt an overwhelming mix of embarrassment and shame. He had never wanted to bring Jack out because he feared moments like this, moments that exposed his son's differences, his vulnerability. The restaurant manager, Mr. Thornton, rushed over immediately. "Mr. Caldwell, please control your son. This is inappropriate. Our staff is not here to entertain children." Thornton's sharp voice cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife. John felt his heart tighten. "Jack, sit down," he commanded in a low, authoritative voice. Jack looked at John, his eyes filled with disappointment. His hand, which had been hesitantly reaching out, slowly wilted like a dying flower. But Mina wouldn't let that happen. She stopped looking from the manager to the powerful man and then to Jack. A gentle smile formed on her lips. "My shift is over, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. She slowly untied her apron and placed it on her tray. Then she turned to Jack, smiled again, and gently took his hand. "I can't dance in my apron." Mina's action stunned everyone in the restaurant. John shot to his feet, a mix of anger and shock on his face. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice full of menace. Mina looked him straight in the eye without fear. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." And just like that, the dance began. Jack, with his heavy metal braces, walked with great difficulty. His legs dragged across the floor, the metal scraping with a soft clatter. But Mina didn't try to lead him or rush him. She simply followed Jack's slow, clumsy steps. She let him be the leader, something no one, not even John, had ever allowed him to be. John stood there motionless, A distant memory flooded back. His wife Elizabeth smiling and dancing with Jack in their living room. "It's not about perfection," she had said. "It's about connection." Mina had created a connection. As she followed Jack's faltering steps, something magical happened. The fear and shame in Jack's eyes slowly changed. The fear gave way to intense focus, and the shame gave way to a shy pride. For the first time since the accident, Jack wasn't being helped, guided, or corrected. He was the one in charge. A woman at a nearby table whispered, "She'll be fired tomorrow." But John didn't hear her. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the reaction of the most powerful man in the room. With a single word, he could end Mina's career, erase her from the world of the wealthy. But in John's mind, only one sound echoed Jack's small, happy chuckle. After 3 clumsy steps, Mina led Jack back to the table. "Thank you for the invitation," she said to Jack, her voice as formal as if she were speaking to an adult. "It was an honor." As she turned to walk away, John called out to her, "Wait." His voice was different now, softer, and full of a quiet turmoil. "What's your full name?" "Mina Johnson, sir." John nodded as if committing the name to memory. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "My office, 9 a.m. tomorrow." The entire restaurant held its breath. Mina took the business card, her hand trembling slightly. Jack looked at John, his eyes filled with confusion. "Dad, why did you do that?" Jack's question, a silent accusation, hung in the air. John looked at his son. In that brief moment, he not only saw the child Elizabeth had entrusted to him, but also a complete person with desires and needs that he had systematically ignored for the past 2 years. That evening, something momentous happened, not just within the walls of the Gilded Spoon, but also within the heart of a powerful man. His life and Mina's life had begun to change with that single clumsy dance. The atmosphere at the Gilded Spoon remained thick with unspoken tension after Mina left. John's words and his cryptic silence were like a sledgehammer silencing all whispers about the waitress's fate. The patrons resumed their meals, but the comfort was gone. Prying, curious eyes were glued to John and Jack's table. John no longer cared about them. His mind was consumed by a chaotic emotion, something he had tried to bury for the past 2 years, helplessness. Jack sat in silence, not eating another bite. He stared into the space where Mina had just stood. The small smile on his face had vanished, but another light, a fragile glimmer of hope, was kindled in his eyes. Jack didn't fully understand what had just happened, but he felt the difference. For the first time, a stranger had listened to him, had followed his rhythm. John paid for the meal in silence. When he led Jack to the car, the boy still didn't say a word. Streetlights flashed past the car window, painting Jack's face with ever-changing streaks of light and shadow. John watched his son in the rearview mirror, sensing a deep chasm opening up between them. "Dad, why did you do that?" Jack's question, a silent accusation, echoed in his mind. John didn't know how to answer. Why had he done it? To soothe his conscience, to prove to himself that he could still control everything? Or for something else? Something he wasn't ready to admit. The Bentley glided through Manhattan's glamorous streets and brought them back to their luxurious penthouse. John put Jack to bed and sat for a long time watching his son fall asleep. Jack's face in sleep was unusually serene. John gently stroked his hair, a gesture he hadn't made in a very long time. He remembered Elizabeth and her radiant smile as she watched Jack dance in the living room. "Don't be afraid of imperfection, my love," she had said. "Seek connection." That night, John couldn't sleep. He paced the cold penthouse, looking out at the glittering city below. Countless skyscrapers, all belonging to him, to his world. But within that world, he felt utterly alone. He had built an empire, yet he had lost the most important connections. Jack's accident hadn't just taken away his ability to walk. It had taken away the closeness between father and son. John, out of fear, had tried to fix his son with the best experts and the most expensive therapies. He thought money could solve everything, but he was wrong. Meanwhile, in an old apartment building in the Bronx, Mina also lay awake. She stared at the ceiling. John Caldwell's business card lay neatly on her bedside table, glinting under the dim nightlight. She knew exactly who he was. John Caldwell wasn't just a name. He was an empire. A name that could make people tremble. And she, a waitress, had refused to obey his command, and even made him flustered. Mina didn't regret her actions for a moment. When she saw Jack reach out, she saw herself in the past. A little girl yearning to be acknowledged, to be seen, to be allowed. She knew that for kids like Jack, the most important thing wasn't pity or help, but respect. When she accepted his invitation to dance, she wasn't just dancing with Jack. She was giving him a chance to lead, to feel he had value. But life wasn't a fairy tale. Mina knew that John Caldwell's meeting invitation could be a trap. Maybe he would fire her, not just from the Gilded Spoon, but from every other restaurant in Manhattan. Or perhaps he would do something worse. She knew the world of powerful people was unforgiving. Despite this, a strange feeling crept into Mina's heart. It wasn't fear, but curiosity. She was curious about why John Caldwell had changed, about why he had called out to her. She felt something deeper, a subtle shift in his cold eyes. Mina turned over, looking out the window. The city lights were still bright, but they no longer felt as distant to her. John Caldwell's business card had created an invisible thread, pulling two different worlds closer together. Mina closed her eyes and told herself, "Anyway, there's nothing to lose. Tomorrow will be a new day." She was ready for whatever would happen. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a fighter, and her fight had just begun. Mina stood before Montgomery Tower, feeling like a grain of sand, lost in a world of glass and steel. The early morning sun reflected off the building's facade, a glare that was both blinding and cold. She adjusted her faded white blouse and old navy blue skirt, taking a deep breath. The coldness didn't just come from the glass. It came from the very air of the place. It was the coldness of power, of wealth, defined by sharp lines and perfect angles, with no room for warmth or the slightest imperfection. Inside, she felt no fear. This feeling wasn't the bravado of a risk-taker, but the calm of someone who had weathered many storms. She had faced bigger challenges in her life. This was simply a confrontation with arrogance. Inside the lobby, she walked confidently to the front desk. "I'm Mina Johnson. I have a 9 o'clock appointment with Mr. Caldwell." The receptionist, a young woman with a cold, flawless appearance, scanned Mina from head to toe with a critical eye. She paused at Mina's worn-out handbag, then curled her lip. "Please wait." She set her tone as if giving an order to a subordinate. After a brief phone call, she pointed to the 18th floor. "Miss Winters will meet you." In the elevator to the 18th floor, Mina clutched her old handbag. Her heart wasn't pounding with anxiety, but with a quiet determination. She knew exactly how people would judge her based on her appearance. She was used to it. But today, she wasn't Mina, the invisible waitress. She was Mina Johnson, the woman with an appointment with John Caldwell. Miss Winters, John's personal assistant, was a woman in her 40s with a sharp look and impeccable posture. She greeted Mina with a cool nod and led her down a long corridor with reflective glass walls. Mina felt the curious stares of employees as she passed. A black woman in an ordinary outfit being led into the executive suite, it was a rare enough event to cause a stir. "He's fired you already, hasn't he?" Winters asked abruptly as they entered a waiting room. "It happens all the time." Powerful clients make a call, and people like you lose their jobs. People like me? Mina smiled slightly. You know what I mean. Staff who don't know their place. Winters replied, adjusting her glasses. Mina looked her directly in the eye. And what exactly is that place? Before Winters could answer, her phone rang. After a few seconds, she gestured to Mina. He'll see you now. John Caldwell's office took up half the floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire Manhattan skyline. The city, with its skyscrapers and bustling traffic, looked like a toy at his feet. John stood with his back to the door as if he were the master of the city itself. Mr. Caldwell, Mina said, her voice calm in the vast space. John turned around. His face was a well-practiced mask of composure and control. Ms. Johnson, thank you for coming. He gestured for her to sit down. Silence filled the room. Mina recognized this as a familiar tactic. It was a type of silence designed to make someone anxious, to make them talk too much and incriminate themselves. But Mina just sat there, unfazed. She had learned that sometimes silence is the most powerful weapon. Finally, John spoke. What are your qualifications? Excuse me, education, degrees. John repeated, his face still emotionless. A bachelor's in child development from NYU, Mina replied, her voice still calm. A master's in special education, incomplete. Something flashed in John's eyes, perhaps surprise. And you work as a waitress? I work 3 jobs, Mina responded, looking straight at him. The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and tutoring when I have students. John walked to his desk and picked up a file. I had you investigated Ms. Johnson. I wanted to understand who danced with my son. He opened the file, revealing photos of a rundown community center. Freedom Steps. You founded it 6 years ago. Mina sat up straighter. I co-founded it with my sister Zoe. It's a dance program for children with physical disabilities. John flipped through some documents. And now, it's about to close due to lack of funding. He looked at Mina, gauging her reaction, but she showed no surprise. Of course he would find all of this out in less than 24 hours. I didn't come here to ask for money, Mr. Caldwell. John gave a slight, joyless smile. Good, he said, getting up restlessly. I want to hire you. Mina blinked, genuinely taken aback. To serve in your home, no. John's face hardened. To be Jack's therapeutic companion. His son's name seemed difficult for him to say. His eyes glanced at a photo on his desk, a smiling woman holding a baby. I have the best experts in the country, John continued. Physical therapists, neurologists, psychologists. But what you did yesterday. He paused as if the words were betraying him. It was just a dance, Mr. Caldwell, Mina said. That was the first time I've seen him smile since the accident. John admitted, his voice full of pain. I don't need a dancer for my son. I need someone who can do what you did. Follow, not lead. Mina looked at the man in front of her. Behind the facade of power and control, she saw a desperate, lost father. I can pay you 5 times what you're making, John said. Mina stood up. No. John looked at her in shock, like a man unaccustomed to hearing that word. I don't work for people who see my skin color or social class before they see my competence, Mina explained calmly. And I certainly don't work for people who try to buy a solution to emotional problems. John's face flushed. You're turning down an offer that could solve all your financial problems out of pride. Out of self-respect, Mina corrected him. And because your son deserves more than someone who's hired to pretend to care. She walked to the door, then stopped. Jack doesn't need more experts. He needs space to lead his own life. You don't understand my son, John said. No, Mina agreed. But I understand people like him. People whose physical limitations are nothing compared to the invisible cages we build around them. She took a business card from her handbag and placed it on John's desk. Freedom Steps classes are on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 p.m. If you want to bring Jack, the first session is free. As Mina left, she walked past Winters, who had clearly been listening behind the door. You just turned down John Caldwell's offer, Winters whispered, her voice full of disbelief. Are you crazy? Mina smiled. Maybe. But I'd rather be crazy than a pawn. Mina left Montgomery Tower feeling a strange sense of relief. She had turned down an offer that could have changed her life, a chance to escape the exhausting cycle of working 3 jobs. But she had no regrets. Her self-respect, her integrity was far more important than a paycheck. She had protected her values, and that was the greatest victory. She took the subway back to the Bronx. During the ride, her mind was still buzzing from the meeting. She knew she had left a lasting impression, not through obedience, but through refusal. She wondered if John Caldwell had ever experienced that feeling before, the feeling of being rejected, of being challenged by someone he considered beneath him. When Mina arrived at her small apartment, Zoe, her sister and confidant, was waiting. Zoe was a woman full of energy, always the biggest supporter of Mina's dreams. She was sitting on their old sofa, a cup of herbal tea in her hands. So how did it go? Zoe asked, looking at her sister's calm face. Mina smiled, shaking her head. I turned him down. Zoe was so surprised she nearly spilled her tea. I knew you wouldn't agree to be his private server, but to turn him down completely, why? It wasn't about the job, sis, Mina said. It was about perspective. He wanted to buy a solution, a companion for Jack, like a piece of high-end furniture. I'm not a piece of furniture, and Jack isn't a project. Mina recounted the entire story, from the offer to her refusal, and how she had given John the Freedom Steps business card. Zoe looked at her sister with admiration. You always see things differently. But I don't think someone like John Caldwell is going to show up at a place like Freedom Steps. Mina looked at her sister, a mysterious glint in her eyes. I didn't think so either. But there's one thing he doesn't know. And that's my final card. Mina walked into her bedroom and retrieved an old notebook from under her bed. The notebook was filled with notes, photos, and complex diagrams. These were the records of her and Dr. Mercer's research, a plan that had been in the works for years. This isn't just a dance program for kids with disabilities, Mina said, her voice filled with passion. It's a neurotherapeutic model. We've proven that when children are given autonomy in movement, when they're allowed to lead their brains, can create new connections, neural pathways that traditional methods considered impossible. And John Caldwell has refused to fund this research 3 times. Zoe was stunned. So, what did you do? I made a bet, Mina said, smiling. When John canceled our last meeting, I promised myself I'd find another way to make him listen. And Jack gave me that chance. I didn't stage the dance, but I recognized the opportunity it presented. I gave him a choice: continue to live in his isolated world or step into ours. I planted a seed, and now it's time for it to grow. Zoe looked at her sister, understanding dawning on her. Billionaires can't be bought. But they can be convinced by a great idea. And you showed him that idea through action. Exactly. Mina nodded. Mina Johnson can be fired, she can be ignored. But Freedom Steps and the results we get are not. They are the truth. And the truth is more powerful than any amount of power. She opened the notebook, pointing to a page of notes about Jack's change after just a few minutes of dancing. She had been observing the boy for a long time. She knew that he didn't just lack motor skills. He lacked confidence and agency. and she had found the key to addressing both of those things in a single dance. Mina closed the notebook. She knew that tomorrow John Caldwell and Jack might not show up at Freedom Steps. But she also knew that she had done everything she could. She had planted the seed of truth, and now all she had to do was wait. Either he would continue to be the cold John Caldwell, or he would become a true father, willing to step out of his cage of power to find his son. Mina's life went on as usual. She still worked at the restaurant and still sold books on weekends. But inside her, a change had taken place. She no longer felt like just a cog in a huge machine. She was the one who had planted the seed of a small revolution. A revolution that started with a single step and might just change the lives of many others. It was Wednesday afternoon, and Mina was organizing old mats in the storage room in preparation for class when a gleaming black Bentley pulled up outside. She recognized it immediately. The entire street seemed to fall silent. Zoe, Mina's sister, who was adjusting the sound system, rushed to the window, her hands trembling as she fixed her headscarf. "I can't believe it," Zoe whispered. "A Bentley. What did you do?" The car door opened, but only Jack got out. The boy, in a meticulously tailored tracksuit, fumbled with his metal leg braces, his eyes restlessly scanning the old building in front of him. The person still behind the wheel was John Caldwell. He was wearing a cashmere sweater and khakis, a clear attempt to look less powerful and more approachable. But the awkward way he gripped the steering wheel and the way his eyes scrutinized everything betrayed that he didn't belong here. "Dad, aren't you coming in?" Jack asked. John didn't answer, just tightened his grip on the wheel. "I told you so," Zoe said, her voice filled with disappointment. "People like him would never come to a place like this." Mina gave a small smile. "Don't underestimate the power of a determined son," she whispered, not to Zoe, but to herself. She knew Jack had fought a private battle with his father to be here. As if he had heard Mina, Jack turned to look at his father, his eyes holding an unusual intensity. He nodded. And then a small miracle happened. John, after a moment of intense internal struggle, opened his car door. He got out, straightened his sweater, and walked toward his son. His face was stiff, but his steps were hesitant, like a man entering a completely foreign land. Freedom Steps was housed in an old warehouse, transformed into a cozy space. Hand-drawn posters with the slogan, "Your rhythm, your rules," were plastered on the walls. When John and Jack walked in, they saw children with various mobility aids moving freely to gentle music. A girl in a wheelchair was spinning gracefully, while another boy with a prosthetic leg practiced dance steps. "Welcome," Mina said, walking over to them in a simple t-shirt with the program's logo. "We're so glad you both could make it." "It seems chaotic," John remarked, clearly uncomfortable. "There is a structure," Mina replied. "It's just not one you're familiar with." She turned to Jack. "Would you like to join?" Jack nodded eagerly, but looked at his father with hesitation. "Go on," John said, his voice strained. "I'll be right here." While Mina helped Jack integrate into the group, Zoe approached John, offering him a chair. "The first day is always the hardest," she said. "For the parents, not the kids." John nodded but didn't sit. "This isn't therapy. I've hired the best rehabilitation specialists." "And what were their results with Jack?" Zoe asked gently. Just then the studio door opened, and an older woman with silver hair leaning on an intricately carved cane walked in. She had a powerful and commanding presence. "Dr. Elaine Mercer," Zoe whispered in John's ear. "Neuroscientist expert on brain plasticity, retired from Harvard." Dr. Mercer greeted a few of the children, and then her eyes landed on John. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her tone sharp. "I didn't expect to see you here." Your foundation rejected my research proposal 3 times in the last 2 years. John felt a punch to the gut. I didn't know you worked here. I oversee the research program, she explained. We're studying how non-directive movement approaches can affect neural reorganization in children with motor issues. Research? John frowned. I thought this was just a community dance class. Mina returned after Jack had blended in with the group. Freedom Steps is a pilot program for motor rehabilitation based on the theory of movement autonomy. We combine adaptive dance with neurological principles. John stared at Mina. If you're running a research program, why are you working as a waitress? Because we don't have enough funding, Mina replied, and because people like you rejected us 3 times. John suddenly understood everything. You were Dr. Mercer's assistant on those proposals. Co-author, Dr. Mercer corrected. Mina had to drop out of her master's program to care for her sister, but her theoretical work is groundbreaking. You knew who I was from the restaurant, John concluded. The moment you walked in, Mina confirmed. And when Jack got up to dance, I saw an opportunity to show you, not just tell you. It was a setup, John asked, his voice icy. Absolutely not, Mina replied. Jack chose to get up. I only chose to follow. Just then, a group of reporters entered the studio. John instantly tensed. What is this part 2 of the plan? Zoe handed John a newly published article on her phone. The headline read, Revolutionary Motor Rehabilitation Method Shows Promising Results. We published our initial findings today, Dr. Mercer explained, and we invited the press. You used my son for a PR stunt. John's voice was frigid. Mina led him to a small room where pictures of dozens of children were plastered on the walls, each with notes about their progress. On the last wall was an empty frame. What's this? John asked. Our future, Mina replied. The full-scale rehabilitation center we could build with proper resources. 500 children a year instead of 50. You orchestrated all of this, John muttered. The dance, the meeting, bringing me here on the day the press was invited. I saw an opportunity and I took it, Mina said. 4 months ago, when you canceled our meeting without reading the proposal, I promised myself I'd find a way. Suddenly, Zoe rushed into the room in a panic. Mina, Jack! They ran back out. Jack was in the middle of the room, surrounded by the other children. The music had stopped, and everyone was watching in silence. Jack had taken off one of his braces and was trying to balance on one leg. Jack. John rushed forward, but Mina held him back. Wait, she whispered. Just watch. Jack took a deep breath, concentrating. Then, to everyone's amazement, especially his father's, he took one full step without the brace. It was small and shaky, but it was entirely his own. Cameras flashed continuously. A cheer went up. John's face, usually cold and impassive, was now completely open with emotion. Tears streamed down his cheeks. That's why we created Freedom Steps, Mina said softly. It's not about perfect steps. It's about the first steps on your own. John looked at his son no longer as a problem to be solved, but as a whole person discovering his own strength. This could have happened without you manipulating me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It could have, Mina replied, if you had returned our calls or read our proposal the 3 times we sent it. The reporters had noticed John. The murmuring grew louder as they recognized the most powerful man in Manhattan standing there. John Caldwell was cornered. He had 2 choices: retreat in anger, confirming his cold, calculated reputation, or embrace the moment his son had created. Caught between the power he always commanded and the freedom his son so desperately needed, John found himself in an entirely new territory, a place where money or influence couldn't dictate the next step. John Caldwell's world was one of absolute control. He was the decision maker, the authority, the one who determined outcomes. But in this moment, in a gritty Bronx warehouse, all the rules were broken. He stood amidst a flurry of flashing cameras, a woman who had challenged him and his son, who had just performed a small miracle. Jack, completely oblivious to the surrounding tension, was savoring his own moment. He had taken a full step unbraced. Now he was practicing his balance, his face lit up with concentration and a newfound pride. He smiled, a bright, free smile that John hadn't seen in 2 long years. John looked at his son, and in that instant, his fortress of defense crumbled. He no longer saw Jack as a project to be fixed, a problem to be managed. He saw a person, a strong soul discovering his own inner power. Tears and emotion he had long buried began to stream down his cheeks. "That's why we created Freedom Steps," Mina said, her voice full of tenderness and strength. "It's not about perfect steps. It's about the first steps on your own." John nodded, unable to speak. He knew what he was witnessing was more valuable than any multi-million-dollar deal. A reporter approached her, voice shattering the emotional silence. "Mr. Caldwell, can you comment on your presence at Freedom Steps today? Is it true your foundation rejected this program's funding 3 times? John took a deep breath. All eyes were on him. In front of him, Jack was still practicing his balance, completely unaware of the burden his father was facing. John looked at his son, then at Mina, and finally he looked directly into the camera. "Do you know what the hardest thing is for a person in my position?" John said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "It's admitting when you're wrong." The entire room went silent. The confession from a man known for his arrogance was a shock. "The Montgomery Foundation is honored to announce its commitment to fully fund Freedom Steps for the next 5 years," John continued, "and to build a permanent rehabilitation center based on the method developed by Dr. Mercer and Ms. Johnson." Camera flashes erupted continuously. Zoe let out an uncontainable cheer. But John wasn't finished. "With one condition," he said, his eyes fixed on Mina, who had been waiting with bated breath. "That Ms. Johnson retains full autonomy over her program and methods without any corporate interference." It was then that Mina finally let out a sigh of relief. She had won. Not a personal victory, but a victory for all the children in this room. 3 months later, the sound of bulldozers and excavators had replaced the soft piano music and clicking of high heels on the empty lot next to the old warehouse. Construction for the new Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center had officially begun. John Caldwell, a man accustomed to building glass and steel skyscrapers, now watched this project with a new kind of attention. It wasn't the most luxurious project his foundation had ever funded, but it was certainly the most creative. Every space was designed with direct input from the children and their families, with Mina as the lead supervisor, ensuring that her vision wouldn't be corrupted by corporate demands. One afternoon, while standing on the dusty construction site holding a set of blueprints, John saw Mina giving instructions to a group of workers. She looked completely different from the invisible waitress in a crisp uniform he had first met. She wore simple work clothes. Her hair was neatly braided, and her face was smudged with a bit of dirt. But her eyes shone with passion. Jack and a few other children were also there, running and playing happily on the lot, imagining the future of the center. "I never thought you'd show up at the board meetings," Mina said, walking over to John, still holding the blueprints. John rubbed his temples. In his hand was a scientific book filled with notes and highlighted sections. "I also never thought I'd be studying neuroplasticity at 50. He replied, his voice a mix of weariness and humor. "But here we are." Mina looked at the man in front of her with curiosity. "Is this part of your public atonement, or are you genuinely interested?" John looked up at her, his eyes far less cold than they used to be. "Last week, Jack asked to take off his second brace," he said, his voice full of emotion. "He told me, 'Dad, I don't want to dance with this thing anymore.'" "I know," he told me. Mina smiled. "His old physical therapist said that wouldn't be possible for at least another 2 years," John continued. "You know I fired her." "You were right. She was wrong." John pointed to a photo of Jack balancing with just one crutch, a picture Mina had taped to the blueprint. "Jack is progressing faster than any traditional medical prognosis." A moment of silence passed. John stared at his son's photo, then turned to Mina, his eyes full of sincerity. "Why have you never accepted my apology?" Mina was surprised. "Because you've never apologized." John frowned. "I rerouted resources, changed policies, funded your program. Isn't that an apology?" "That's compensation," Mina gently corrected. "An apology is an act of humility. You're simply fixing a financial mistake." John nodded slowly. "Right again." He turned to look at the construction site where the excavators were diligently at work. The John of 3 months ago would have only seen the financial figures and the PR benefits. But the John of today saw a different picture: Jack and the other children being given the chance to write their own stories. He had bought a project, but in return he had found something money couldn't buy: a lesson in humility. The conversation between John and Mina ended, but the seeds of reflection it had planted in John's heart remained. He stood alone, watching the excavators dig into the earth. In the past, every construction project was a symbol of power and dominance. His towers reached high, challenging the sky, proving his superiority over others. But this project was different. It didn't reach high. It dug deep into the ground, creating a solid foundation. And that was what was happening within him. John was digging deep into the hidden corners of his soul, rebuilding his life's foundation, not with power, but with understanding. He still came to the construction site regularly, but no longer in expensive suits or with a condescending attitude. Instead, he wore simple polo shirts, listening to the engineers, and especially listening to Mina. He learned about how gentle slopes could help children in wheelchairs move more easily, about non-slip floor materials, and about reinforced glass that could withstand impact. He asked Mina why she chose a warm color palette instead of the cold, professional colors typically found in medical centers. Mina explained that colors can also heal. They create a safe space, a place where children feel welcome, not like patients. John, who was only familiar with the black, white, and gray palettes of the corporate world, was beginning to see another world full of color and emotion. One afternoon, as John was reviewing a blueprint, Jack and a few other children ran up to him. "Uncle John, look," a little girl said, holding a toy mini wheelchair. "We're designing a therapeutic garden. Can you help us?" John, a billionaire accustomed to giving orders, now knelt on the ground, listening to a group of kids explain the importance of having plants with different textures to stimulate touch, and how the pathways needed to be wide enough for wheelchairs. He was no longer Mr. Caldwell, but Uncle John, a new, humbler role, but one that brought him a joy that money could never buy. John realized that the invisible walls he had built around Jack and around himself weren't just a result of the accident. They were a consequence of a lifestyle. He had lived in a world where control was supreme, and when Jack was hurt, he had tried to control the pain itself. He had turned Jack into a project, a problem to be solved, instead of a person to be loved. And Mina, with just one small act, had shown him that brutal truth. John's transformation wasn't limited to the construction site. He had started to spend more time with Jack. He listened to his son talk about his new friends at Freedom Steps, about his small steps forward, about the dreams he was beginning to have again. He read the books on neuroplasticity that Mina had recommended. He realized that Jack's world wasn't a world of limitations. It was an expanding world. It had taken him 2 years to realize that, and the regret gnawed at him every night. One day, Mina arrived at the site early and found John sitting alone next to the empty photo frame on the blueprint. It was the frame for the full rehabilitation center. He was looking at it lost in thought. Mina sat down next to him. "Do you remember this frame?" Mina asked softly. "Our future." "I remember," John replied. "I once thought it was a pipe dream. Now I see it more clearly than anything else." He turned to look at Mina. "I was wrong. About you, about Jack, about everything. The apology you wanted to hear. Here it is." He said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mina Johnson, I am sorry. I'm sorry for seeing you as an object. I'm sorry for treating my son like a project. I'm sorry for wasting 2 precious years of his life." Mina's own tears began to fall. "You have done so much to right that wrong, Mr. Caldwell. And that's what matters most." "No," John said, shaking his head. "What matters most is that Jack showed me a better path, and you gave me the courage to follow it. Thank you, Mina." They sat in silence, looking out at the construction that was taking shape. It wasn't just a center. It was a symbol of a profound change. A billionaire had found the true meaning of power, not in control, but in understanding and sharing. A woman had found a way to turn pain into strength. And a little boy had found freedom in his own steps. 6 months later, the opening day of the Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center arrived. The event was a complete contrast to the cold dinner at the Gilded Spoon. The spacious hall, now filled with natural light and warm colors, was buzzing with laughter and music. Dozens of children with all kinds of mobility aids were moving freely, performing spontaneous dances filled with joy and confidence. In the center of the hall, Jack, now wearing only a lightweight brace on his left leg, was leading a small group of 3 other children in a simple but meaningful routine. His movements were still limited, but they flowed with a self-assurance that no doctor had ever predicted. John stood from a distance, neither interfering nor controlling. He had learned his hardest lesson. Mina walked over to him, smiling. "He doesn't need you to hold him up anymore." John nodded, his gaze fixed on his son. "You're right," he agreed. "But he still needs me to be here." "That's a very important difference," Mina said. A reporter approached John. "Mr. Caldwell, how do you feel watching your son's progress?" John turned to look at Jack, who was helping a younger girl regain her balance. He smiled. "I'm proud," he said, his voice full of emotion. "But not because of what he overcame, but because of what he's created for others." "And what's the biggest lesson you've learned on this journey, Mr. John Caldwell?" the reporter asked. John, once known only for his financial empire, looked directly into the camera, speaking with a definitive but humble tone. "True leaders aren't those who guide others down a path they believe is right, but those who are brave enough to follow when someone shows them a better way." A year later, the Freedom Steps program had expanded to 3 new cities. Mina received the Innovator in Pediatric Rehabilitation Award, and her method began to be adopted in hospitals across the country. Jack, now using a light cane only on difficult days, had returned to school and became the program's young spokesperson, inspiring other children to find their own rhythm. And John had learned the hardest and most valuable lesson of his life. True power isn't about controlling every step, but about knowing when to step back and let someone else lead. The story of John, Mina, and Jack wasn't just about a dance. It was about a quiet revolution that changed their lives forever, showing that the most profound revolutions don't start with grand declarations or billion-dollar fortunes, but with the courage to take a first genuine step and the wisdom to follow.